thank you to everyone who's joining. I'm very, very excited to be joined by our special guest, Omar Al-Qattan. My name is Mike Yimhenna. I'm going to be running the interview and your host this evening. I'm very honored to welcome our special guest, Omar Al-Qattan, who is a graduate from Oxford University and INSAS in Brooklyn. He is a filmmaker and producer who has won many prestigious awards for his films made both about Palestine and about other things. Omar is the founding member of the Al-Qattan Foundation and established the Mosaic Rooms in London in 2008. Aside from working on various movies, Omar was the chair of the 2013 and 2015 Shubbak Festivals of Contemporary Arab Culture in London and is the chair of the Palestinian Museum in the Occupied Territories. He has written prolifically about art and film in the region, and we are honored to have Omar join afikra Conversations. Thank you so much for joining.
Hi, thank you very much, Mickey. I just want to correct that I went to ANSAS in Brussels, not in Brooklyn.
Oh, did I say Brooklyn?
Yeah.
Some things, when I say words that start with a BR, it's hard to get out any other words. So thank you so much.
Probably would have been more fun.
Well, Omar, you're calling us from London today, right?
Yes.
And I'm really, really curious about your experience. You know, you were born in Beirut. You spent some of your childhood in Beirut. You spent some of your childhood across the Arab world and in Europe. But most of your focus has been on Palestine and the art and the culture of Palestine.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when did you decide that you wanted to start going into the cultural sector and focus really on the art and culture of Palestine?
Well, there's sort of two questions. I think the answer to the first is that I was interested in literature and from a young age, and then theater and music as well. At one stage, I wanted to become a singer. The eventual arrival at working in film was partly because I wanted to do so many things in the arts, and film is a synthetic medium in many ways. It sort of allows you to work across different disciplines. But the engagement with Palestine, I think, was quite, inevitable and inescapable, because the question of Palestine is central to our lives and our preoccupations, my parents and my friends. And of course, apart from being a personal preoccupation, it's, I think, the preoccupation of many people interested in justice and regardless of their origins.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you said film is a synthetic medium. So it combines a lot of your passions: music, storytelling, visual arts. You started writing your first sort of feature film is Dreams in Silence. Is in the early 90s. I think I got that right.
It wasn't a feature film, it was a documentary.
It was a documentary, yeah. Feature documentary, excuse me. Can you walk me through how you approached that? You were, coming out of school.
The late 80s and early 90s were, they were one of the sort of major preoccupations or events, if you like, or movements, was the rise in conservative political Islam. And when I started my film career, I hadn't come across any serious work, certainly not from an Arab or Muslim perspective on this phenomenon. And so, in a rather foolhardy way, I decided to tackle it in my first film. And my other preoccupation was that I didn't really want to create a television documentary. I wanted to understand the personal and social implications of this movement, where it came from, and how it affected people's lives, people's thinking, and so on. And by pure coincidences, very often these things happen. While I was researching the film, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and then eventually the war in Kuwait took place. So, and I had decided to make this film in Jordan, where this phenomenon was quite marked and very interesting. And of course, that moment of crisis allowed or offered the film its kind of dramatic framework. And I decided to read the situation, the phenomenon, through the eyes of a wonderful but illiterate lady from one of the refugee camps in Amman. And so it's her story and her family story, but it's also the story of that moment, yeah, and of that phenomenon.
Yeah. So when you originally you were drawn into documentaries, what was the process like expanding sort of beyond that that specific medium and moving into scripted?
We were never taught to think I mean, film is one and the same language, in the same way that when you write fiction or when you write nonfiction, you're using some of the same tools and certainly some of the principal tools of a language. I think that it impoverishes any work to sort of think any work of fiction, to think of it outside of its relationship to the realities from which it's inspired or it grows, and vice versa. I think a work of documentary devoid of the poetry and the evocativeness or the sort of indirect means of expression that is used in fiction is also impoverished.
Yeah.
So we kind of never thought. I mean, of course, there are people who are much stronger at making documentaries than they are at fiction and so on. And actually, I never, apart from making a few short films, I only ever produced feature films. I never directed any, because it's a pretty momentous, task, and I think there are very, very few people are really up to it. But anyway, I never thought of the two things as different.
Yeah, before the call, we were talking about this briefly, about the idea of production. The word producer in many media is a slippery topic, is a slippery title. It's not entirely clear what the job description is, and it can mean many different things. Throughout your career, you've sort of served as a cultural producer. You've helped build institutions, you've helped produce films, you've built production companies that are trying to, produce films. How do you see yourself through that lens? Do you see yourself with that title of, cultural producer? Is that something that makes sense to you?
I think that my entry into this world coincided also with the slow realization that that the cultural sector needed to become or to be a market.
Yeah.
It needed to behave like a market, and it needed to have its own laws. It needed to be protected and subsidized as well. And it probably also needed to be independent of political movements and governments in a way that ensured its democratic and expressive freedoms, and it ensured its aesthetic independence and the right to tackle different subjects that may or may not be approved by official bodies like government. So
yeah.
In the 80s and 90s, this was the moment of in the Palestinian case, it was the moment of the demise of PLO involvement in the cultural field, and at the same time, the slow rise of new independent players, funders of cultural production, whether it was film or literature or any other format. And that sort of marriage, if you like, that meeting between the marketplace, and I don't mean it in any particularly judgmental way. I think it's part of human nature. It always has been, buying and selling. It's not that I'm condemning or condoning, but it was important to realize that that there was no innocence about the cultural production. It had to tackle the needs to raise funding, to sell itself, to protect itself with laws, and this required not just individual effort but institutional effort, and I think that's something I tried to contribute to. And it was also taking a leaf out of my own family's involvement in this field from early on. So my parents, who have now passed away, were very keen supporters of the arts before it became fashionable. So I think they were the first to, for example, publish Emil Habibi's novel outside of occupied Palestine. In the Arab world, they supported, I think, the first collection of poems by poets from the 1948 Palestine, and so on. And of course, they and my uncle, who's still alive, were instrumental in the making of the first Palestinian feature film, Wedding in Galilee, who some of you may know. And this was before I was even out of university. So it came from a sense that this aspect of our lives was absolutely essential, just as other forms of militancy or campaigning or working or on behalf of the Palestinian cause were. And from that, different people did things in different ways, both progressively and in a reactionary way, so that the funding is obviously never, as I said, is never innocent. And but we tried to do this in a systematic and long-term way, so as to really establish cultural production in Palestine, but also across the Arab world. And I think I'm proud to say that the Palestinian example was actually an inspiration for many other institutions. But we tried to show that this was not a contradiction. There was no contradiction between the marketplace and artistic expression and freedom. Of course, it's a constant battle and it needs to be protected and fought for, but one cannot really function without the other.
How, since we started talking about the ecosystem and building a full ecosystem of artists and practitioners, do you see that you have a role to sort of also educate the public to value the arts and value culture? Has that been a hurdle? Both by public, I guess I mean two groups of people, both end users and sort of consumers, not in a capitalistic way, but sort of the users of art and these what all the work that you're producing, but also the sort of ecosystem of possible funders and donors who should really be patrons for the arts. Do you feel like you have a role to sort of educate those two groups of stakeholders?
I don't presume to educate anyone really except myself, but it's really about making things available.
Okay.
So in 2005, the Al-Qattan Foundation created a center for the child in Gaza City. Originally, this was a library just focused on children's literature, but gradually it became so much more than that. It became a resource for learning the sciences and IT and arts and crafts. It was a hub for different sorts of clubs, and then it became the center of a network of smaller associated centers across the Gaza Strip, where children could find resources like books and films and the means to make art and the means to work in robotics and science and so on. So making available, similarly, for making opportunities available for artists and teachers, which we do across the whole of the country. And then also in more recent years, making the products of the very rich culture of the Arab world available internationally, but especially in the UK, where most of my family eventually settled. And so it's really, rather than educate, it's really making available and promoting. And yes, the example that we set, I'm very proud to say, was eventually adopted by many people. Now the problem is, some of it is adopted in a rather reactionary and conservative way, and some of it was done in a very progressive way. So you have a range of state-sponsored organizations that kind of and I won't mention which, but which kind of copy and pasted what we were doing to more interesting and much smaller organizations and youth groups and across. I can tell you about Palestine and Lebanon because I know them across the region.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a form of flattery, but so I want to ask something about that sort of self-serving and selfish for me as somebody who's trying to do this work with afikra. I'm curious how us in the sort of cultural space who are trying to tell stories from the region, how do you balance trying to tell similar stories over and over again that are about justice and about peace and about some of the atrocities that have taken place in the 20th century in the region, and balance that with telling the broader story of the histories and culture of the region, or in this case, Palestine in specific. How do you sort of balance those? How have you specifically balanced them in your filmmaking and also in the types of organizations that you support?
So do you mean how to make them universal? Or is that what you're asking?
No. Like we always talk about trying to explore other sections of the library and tell stories about architecture and geology and, poetry and film and music and all these things that exist throughout the library, as opposed to really only telling the stories about, in this case, maybe about the occupation or about some of the, injustices that are taking place. How have you sort of balanced that? Because it seems like you've done a great job. I'm curious how what your approach is.
First of all, I really dislike this word balance. I think it's I really understand what you mean. And secondly, I think that the occupation affects every aspect of life.
Sure.
Whether it's architecture or whether it's food or whether it's your standard of living, it affects everything. And I think that a profound and perceptive artistic treatment of even the smallest subject, whether it's in a short story or in a feature film or in a work of art, the more complex its vision, the more it will introduce you to the richness of somebody's experience, even if that experience is saliently about a specific political condition. And that's really the difference between, I think, for example, in film, a sort of poorly made, simplistic television report and a really rich treatment of a subject matter, even if it's a simple one. But if it's richly treated, it can introduce you to all aspects of a situation. So I don't see it as a balancing act. I see it as a necessity of somebody doing their work properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just because you've been working on a lot of stuff, I want to talk briefly about some of the challenges associated with opening the museum. So, I was listening to an interview with you where you were mentioning how, ideas are easy. They're easy to conceive of, beautiful ideas, but the work is what's challenging. And if you could sort of shed some light on some of the challenges at the beginning of that process and some of the challenges that still remain.
Well, there were conceptual challenges. We wanted to create a museum which didn't have a collection. By the way, we were not the first. The African American Museum in Washington, D.C. had the same challenge at its beginnings, and received the same sort of denigration from usually white male journalists about that we did. But more importantly, I mean, we had several issues very specific to Palestine and actually the whole region. First of all, we didn't really have a lot of recruitment was a major issue. First of all, because it's very hard to get internationals work permits in the occupied territories. Secondly, because there were very few Palestinians who had experience in the field of museumology and the associated disciplines. Third of all, because we probably were more optimistic than we should have been about our ability to raise funding and persuade people to donate objects. And I think that we overcame some of those eventually. It took some painful experiences, but we now have a great director and a great team. We've done 5 major exhibitions using different collections from different parts of the world. And one of these exhibitions was a sort of satellite exhibition in Beirut back in 2016 during the opening phase. And we've now become an independent institution, whereas before we were affiliated with Ta'awun, the Welfare Association. And gradually our governance and our programmatic development is really taking shape. But we're still under occupation, we still have major financial challenges, and we are totally dependent on our individual donors and a few institutional donors. For example, we have a very large British donor who's helped us with the creation of our digital archive. But even that, took a lot of persuasion and work, very serious work to get them on board. So on. I mean, I think that we will continue to have challenges, as do most cultural institutions in the region, independent cultural institutions. And but I'm pretty optimistic that we will just go from one success to the next. We have a very good educational outreach program. I mean, all these things nobody believed we would have, and we also have a small collection now that is growing, partly from donations and partly from small acquisitions that we've been able to make. But the Middle East is very old. Palestine, especially, and all of the region is very old. A few years is nothing, so sure. It takes us 10, 15 years to build this wonderful institution. So be it. And by the way, when we started the Al-Qattan Foundation in the mid-90s, and then opened in Palestine in 98, people also looked quite a lot of surprise at what we were doing. Why were we working in culture, and why were we so interested in teachers and young artists. And of course, within a few years after that, it became very acceptable. Not just that, but very attractive, and a lot of young people started studying in these disciplines, and the whole sector grew very fast, not just in Palestine but across the region. So
yeah. So So in those 22 years since '98, since it was sort of incorporated in Palestine, you mentioned that the results have changed. But if I were speaking to you in 1998, what would you have been surprised about? What would you have sort of not seen coming around the corner?
To be honest, how quickly we grew, and the extraordinary enthusiasm and support that we had from all sorts of people on the ground and abroad. Not financially necessarily. Actually, that's the least important part. It was more the moral support and the recognition of the importance of what we were doing, because also, sadly, in parallel, there was a failure, a social and political failure in Palestine and across the region. And to have these successful institutions that were honoring their employees, keeping employees, protecting their employees, investing in them and in their beneficiaries, and at the same time being run transparently and efficiently and independently, offered a hope. But it also meant that we could do things to a very, very high standard and an excellent standard. And if we could do it in an institutional framework, then the question then is posed, is why can't we do it on a larger scale? Why can't we run our countries like this in this way? So, I'm surprised by how quickly we grew and how we've maintained a certain standard of excellence. And I'm not surprised, because I always knew how talented, there are talented people everywhere. But I think the nice thing about a really good idea, to go back to the good ideas, it tends to attract really smart and interesting and talented people. And we've been really lucky with that.
I want to talk about your work as both telling the story of Palestine, both in Palestine and creating this cultural sector that you are working to create by building these institutions. But I'm also interested in the work that you're doing about that brings people to Palestine, or brings people to the region in the UK and abroad, both through your films and through these institutions that you've sort of helped lead in the UK, whether it's Mosaic Rooms or Shubbak, or the films that you create that are broadcast everywhere. Can you talk briefly about where the idea for Mosaic Rooms, how it sort of emerged, and the reception that it's had in the UK?
Yeah, it was slightly accidental, to be very honest.
Yeah.
We wanted to move into a permanent office, which from a sort of purely investment perspective made sense at the time, when rents were really skyrocketing in the commercial sector in London. And we as a British institution, we had to be registered here. So, and then we found this dilapidated building, which had been under offer, and somebody had paid 10% to the sellers and then disappeared. So we were so we found it at a sort of 10% discount. But it was dilapidated and it needed a lot of work, and it was really rather too grand to be an office only. Mm-hmm. And so we thought, after discussion and reflection, that maybe we would use part of it as an office, and then make the rest of it into a public space, but dedicated to the cultures of the Arab world, and and beyond. And the other sort of incentive was that the domination of certain images of the Arab world and the Muslim world in the media, but also among many intellectuals and writers here, the domination of a certain political set of cliches, terrorism and violence and chaos and so on. Mm-hmm. We felt that somebody had to offer different renderings of this wonderful part of the world, this fount of civilization and ideas. Was all you could see around you was violence, and it was mainly in the news, and so I think we wanted to offer an alternative entry point, mm-hmm. Especially to young people who could never have a chance of being presented here, whether in visual arts or film or literature. And then eventually we became part of the Shubbak Festival of Contemporary Arab Culture, which we supported, and I sort of chaired for two rounds, and now is a flourishing festival. I think it's probably, sadly, it's sad that it's in London rather than an Arab capital, but it's probably the largest of its kind festival of young Arab culture. Yeah. And contemporary Arab culture, and certainly probably the freest and most independent.
And how has the reception been from non-Arab audiences?
Well, most of our audience is non-Arab. Our surveys show about 65%. So, and they keep coming. So we must be doing something right.
Yeah. And has that been true of your films as well? Some of the more recent films. So if we talk about, Zindeeq.
No. We I think that film and television are huge strategic industries, mm-hmm. and they are therefore particularly dangerous and threatening to the powers that be and to vested interests, and they also, more importantly, maybe need the support of a strong economy and strong national policies to support the process of filmmaking. We always laugh and say, Tarkovsky had made most of his films with the support of the Red Army. They were there as extras and with their engineering corps and their logistics, and whereas most Arab filmmakers, and including the Palestinians, don't have that. So we're in a much more fragile position. We're in a fringe position. We're in a very niche position. And while we've had the occasional success, it's been a very passing and probably quite limited one. And until we manage to build our cultural economies and in a democratic way and rope in cultural support from governments who are democratically elected, then I don't see how we can possibly accede to a position of greater influence in these fields. I don't know if I've answered this in a roundabout.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying.
We've had success, but it's always felt that we were, we were resistant hugely. And there's another factor that I should add is that when you broach difficult subjects, for example, in Zindeeq, the last film I produced, and that was already now it's 11 years ago. One of the themes of that film is civic violence, and it presents a very sort of dystopian and picture of a Palestinian returning, if you like, to Palestine. But although that's I hope you can see the film someday, but it was jarring and provocative. And just as in 1987, when Wedding in Galilee was, which became a success of its limited, okay, but still a success, was very provocative and upset a lot of people because they felt that it represented a sort of degenerate version of Palestinian society. So I think, but you have to be prepared. You know, if you work in these fields, you have to be prepared for rejection and criticism. But what is very dispiriting and very discouraging is really that we go out into the world with virtually no support, and apart from the moral support of our friends and so on.
Omar, I want to get to the questions that are coming in the chat. If we have time at the end, I'd love to be able to talk to you about some of the writing that you've been doing and that as a medium. So let's do these quick fire questions, and then we'll go to the chat, and then we'll come back if we have time. So the first one is, what are you reading or watching right now?
So I've been very lucky to be on a translation prize. Arabic literature translation prize, and one of the nice pleasures of being on these juries is that you get to receive a lot of books, and in this case, books in Arabic, in the original Arabic plus the translation. So at the moment, I'm reading this and discovering, actually, for the first time, this amazing Moroccan novelist called Youssef Fadel, and I'm reading his last novel, Farah, which in English is translated as, and I've written it down because it's so long, a shimmering red fish swims with me. It's really cool. It's a beautiful love story, but a very political novel as well, that tells the story of the destruction of parts of the old city of Casablanca when they built that horrendous big mosque a few decades ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
And say the author one more time.
Youssef Fadel.
Youssef Fadel. Okay, great. Okay, who would you shadow for a day, past or present, if you could?
You know, I've been thinking about this, and I thought, actually, rather than somebody big and famous, I would probably really love to be able to shadow either of my parents when they were children in Palestine, just for one day.
Did they grow up in the same city?
No.
Which cities did they grow up in?
My father in Jaffa, and then Jerusalem, and my mother in Tulkarem.
They met in Kuwait later.
Yeah. After the Nakba,
yeah. Okay, what do most people misunderstand about your work or your line of work?
So I think some people think that the cultural projects is some kind of fun luxury thing one does on the side, and that they are sort of probably the preoccupations of the vain, and sadly, very few people actually understand how the potential for these projects to be progressive and life-changing and inspiring.
Okay, whose work do you admire or are inspired by? I imagine there are many.
There's so many, but for many, many years, I had in my wallet a photograph of the Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini, who I always think of as an example because he was so engaged politically. As a journalist, he wrote a weekly column, he wrote novels, but he was also an absolutely brilliant and innovative filmmaker. And I keep going back to his writings and his films even now.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, thanks for sharing those. We're going to go to the questions. We have 3 questions so far, so if you have any more, please type them in. So we'll start with Brahim.
I wanted to know, have you ever, any part of your work or been censored by any Arab government?
The first time I personally experienced it was a sort of Kafkaesque situation. In 1992, the Damascus International Film Festival invited me to show my first film, Dreams in Silence, and my friend and colleague, Michel Khleifi, to show 3 or 4 of his films. I couldn't travel at the time for personal reasons, so he went. And when he arrived, he learned that Dreams in Silence was not going to be shown and had been censored, even though it was in the program. And worse than that, 2 of his 3 films that had been also been invited had been censored. So yes, that was a very unfortunate start to my experience with government festivals and organizations. And of course, yeah, since then, there's always, I mean, the problem is, of course, it's not just censorship by cutting out bits of film, but it's also by not showing on the networks, on the formal networks, official networks, and not promoting and so on, and sometimes even getting journalists to attack you in the press.
Okay, so Nadia, then Mona, and then Soraya.
Thank you for the talk, Mikey and Hamad. I was lucky enough to watch The Tale of the Three Jewels when Palestine Film Institute was screening it during lockdown. And I just wanted to ask what it was like working on that film. If I'm not mistaken correctly, it's the first film filmed in Gaza, right? And is there an opportunity it will become more accessible, because I want to watch it again already? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, that was an absolutely awe-inspiring experience. It was the first feature film ever to be produced in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. And we made it when the Israelis were still physically there, so before the Palestinian Authority came back in May '94. We finished filming in April. But the most amazing part of it was how supportive and collaborative and inspiring our Gazan colleagues were. We started filming on the second day of shooting. The infamous Hebron massacre took place in Hebron.
Wow.
In which a Jewish settler, I can't remember the exact number of victims, but shot dead, I think, over 30 people who were praying. And so the whole place erupted in anger, and the Israeli army imposed a 24-hour curfew, and so it was panic for us because we were already filming and so on. And we had to make a decision to either evacuate and film somewhere else or stay. And the other wonderful thing was that the crew we had, who were French and Belgian, only like 12 of them, refused to leave and said, we're not gonna film anywhere else. And we actually stayed, even though one of our producers, the BBC, was shouting down the telephone at me to make us leave. But we stayed and finished after the things had calmed down. We continued. That was amazing. To answer your question about availability, so we have been working with the Belgian Cinémathèque, the official film institute, to restore all the films we made together, including this one and all of Michel's feature films, and mine as well, my documentaries. And we're working on making these available on a sort of new platform very soon. So I'll keep an eye out.
I came in a bit late, so I'm not sure if it was covered. I was interested in what kind of projects you're working on, and if there is a way for somebody who's outside to help, and especially like a volunteer. Thank you.
It depends where you're based. So are you based anywhere near the region, or in London? Or?
I am in Dubai, but there's also different options. Like I have friends who are interested that I can share the States and so on.
Well, I think that it really depends what your interest is. I mean, you could be an artist who has a project that they'd like to work on. You could be a musician, or there's so many ways that we could work together as an institution with you. If you're talking about financial support, then that would be wonderful. We can talk about that as well. If you're talking about volunteering, the best at the moment, unfortunately, because of COVID-19, our volunteering program is really down to very, very basics. But we usually, especially in the child center in Gaza, we have a pretty extensive volunteer program for usually young people who just finished school and who are interested in working with children in different ways. And also in the Ramallah Cultural Center, where the Al-Qattan Center in Ramallah, there are also opportunities. But I think we'll have to wait out this year and see how the COVID crisis evolves. Thank you for your offering.
Can I interject, or it's not okay?
Sure.
Actually, I'm thinking about young Palestinians, or maybe not necessarily Palestinians, who are like maybe university graduates who have a passion to help and don't know like venues to help. So it could be like long distance. That's the point. I mean, they don't have to be in Palestine. So.
Okay, well, I haven't thought about this, and I will ask my colleagues, maybe if you could share your contacts with Mickey, and I'll get back to you.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks, Mona. I think we can take one more from Suraya.
I was going to say that I heard you say that the Shubbak festival, that you wish it wasn't in London, or it was a pity that it was in. I remember one summer I spent the summer going to.
No, I didn't say it. I'm sorry. I may have expressed myself vaguely. When I said I'm sorry that such a wonderful festival, which is the largest of its kind, should be in London rather than in an Arab capital. I mean, I think it should be in both, but it's sad that there isn't an Arab capital anymore where you can have a manifestation like this, which is independent and uncensored and so on. That's all I meant.
Okay. Because it was amazing to see all the people come together. I mean, I had the opportunity to see Ayman Safia, the late Palestinian dancer, which performed there. And I was also wondering, do you know the future of the Qalandiya International? I know you've been involved in.
I don't have the latest updates. It's not happening this year for sure. But I hope next year I think that's its next iteration is next year, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, I think it will carry on.
One last question from Lubna, and then I have a question to end with as well. Lubna, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, hi everyone, and hi Omar. I know so much about your work because I am a graduate student. I have been.
Can you raise your voice a little bit because I can't hear you?
Okay. Hi Omar. Can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, I am actually a graduate student, and I have been studying the Palestinian cinema for a while. I'm more concerned of the Palestinian cinema in the 1970s, and I was wondering if you think Qattan Foundation or the Palestinian Museum would be interested in creating something similar to a Palestinian film archive, because I think like there is a priority, and especially knowing that your history with film production, I thought you would be also interested in that.
So we sort of tried to do something similar in 2004, 2005. The problem is that there are some efforts to bring together information about different films, but and most notably an Iraqi director called, I think, Qais Zubaydi, has written a sort of a small encyclopedia of what has been made by whom. But the actual physical creation of an archive, I mean, I think that would be great, especially now with technology, which allows so much to be done by internet. The problem is, I think you need a certain Well, there are several problems. First of all, is that a lot of films are still in circulation commercially. Secondly, also that they're all over the world. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I think you need an official kind of body to give comfort to people to kind of donate their films and feel that that they're safe and they're going to be treated. And we could eventually do that, but it's quite a huge project. What I can tell you is that our films are now donated to the Al-Qattan Foundation, who will keep them and conserve them and make them available. So, but I don't know, maybe we can eventually persuade others to do the same. I don't know, we'll see. But a great idea.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lubna. I guess, Omar, if you will permit me, I'll ask you one really simple question. What do you hope that you're working on in 10 years?
Oh
Yes.
my goodness.
What problems are you trying to solve 10 years from now? Ideally.
Well, I'd like to see a more equitable and prosperous and peaceful Arab world, and a free one, especially Palestine, but all of the Egypt and everywhere, the Gulf. So that's my preoccupation, really. I don't know if I can really do much about it in my own way, but I will try.
Well, yeah, I hope so. I hope you succeed. I hope we all succeed.
Actually, I hope this for all the world, not on a kind of nationalism, but that area in particular is a specific preoccupation.
Yeah.
It might by then.
Yeah. Thank you, Omar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure, even though I didn't see any of you, but very nice to meet you.
Yeah. Hopefully we see you soon. Thanks
Bye.
so much.